Welcome to the Alpine Club in Shoreditch. I'm Beth, I'm the librarian, and today I'm going to be taking you around our exhibition Women with Altitude, 100 Years of Alpine Climbing in the Pinnacle Club and Alpine Club. The exhibition was jointly curated by Adele Long, Suzanne Strother and Rosemary Scott, all of whom are from the Pinnacle Club and the Alpine Club. The exhibition was also funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund and also by the Hackney Council's Hello Again Hackney grant. I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you to our sponsors for enabling us to put on this exhibition. I'm very excited to take you around today. If you have any questions, please do pop them in the comments section and I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as possible. So, to begin the tour, the historian Arlene Blum writes that the question, why do you climb, is often posed to mountaineers. However, that question has historically taken on a slightly different edge when it's women on the end of the rope. In the early 19th century, climbing, especially in the Alps, was the provenance of a very select number of scientists, wealthy, rich European men, often with a lot of leisure time and money. In the mid-19th century, you start to see a shift and mountaineering becomes something more of a sport, but even so, still one that is mostly pursued by a very select group of men. It often required pushing oneself to mental and physical limits. And if you think about the fact that in this time, mountains were often perceived as these mysterious, quite threatening presences. At the same time, women are thought of as quite delicate, frail creatures that need to be protected. And so to go into the mountains as a woman to climb was to break a number of social rules. So women faced a number of not only social constraints, but practical ones too. Women would climb in skirts and corsets, and if they reached a difficult section of the climb, they would often hitch up their skirts using a series of rings and string inside the skirt system. Sometimes women would take off their skirts and climb with just pants or bloomers. They'd hide their skirts under rocks and then pick them back up as they were approaching the towns. And this practice became known as slipping off and on. Skirts posed a number of problems. They could weigh up to 15 pounds, and a very long trailing skirt could often dislodge these rocks, so posed a number of objective dangers as well. Not to mention the fact that corsets obviously restricted breathing, and you can imagine the effect that this has for women climbing at altitude. To go into the mountains could often elicit very strong criticism, and it's worth noting that sometimes the harshest critics of women climbers were actually other women. A classic example of this is the pioneering female alpinist Elizabeth the Blonde, and Le Blonde's mother received a very harshly worded note from her aunt in which she begged the woman, please stop Elizabeth from climbing, she is scandalising the whole of London. And there's a wonderful photograph of Elizabeth wearing a full face mask to protect herself from the alpine sun. And you get this very strong sense that this is a woman who really doesn't care what anyone else thinks. That being said, women have always been present in the mountains. In 1808, the French maid Maria Paradis first climbed Mont Blanc. She describes being dragged up by her companions, at one point even begging them to throw her into a crevasse to end her suffering. I mean, we have all been there. But in 1838, Henrietta de Angeville actually funds and organises an expedition to climb Mont Blanc herself. She describes the experience of climbing the summit in very salacious terms. She describes it as being late to her own wedding, and she says she looks forward to the hour where she could lie on his summit. Make of that what you will. In a classic and very different example, in the 1850s, Jane Freshfield describes climbing in the mountains as an almost transcendent religious experience. It's something that she says brings her closer to God. And Lucy Walker, the first woman to climb the Matterhorn in 1871, she took up climbing with her family members after being encouraged to do so by a local doctor as a cure for rheumatism. Now, Walker eventually established such a strong relationship with her guide, Melika Anderegg, that on one occasion she was asked why she'd never married, and she said, I have two loves, the mountains and Melikor is already married. Now I think what this even brief snapshot of women's climbing history shows us is that women went into the mountains for a number of different reasons. Some wanted to very explicitly talk about their experiences in gendered and embodied terms. Others weren't really concerned with the physical, and it was much more about the spiritual. But I think the overwhelming point here is that women have always been present in the mountains. Snapshots really show us some of the complexities that are present in women's mountaineering throughout history. You can already see that some women want to very explicitly frame their experiences in terms of gender and embodied, physical, fleshy experiences. Others want to talk very much about the spiritual and the transcendent, and we can already see a range of motivations behind why women go into the mountains. It's important to note at this point that women's experiences of early climbing were often praised. So Henriette d'Angeville, for example, describes celebrations in Chamonix following her successful ascent of Mont Blanc, but she does quite shrewdly note that she suspects the reception would have been very different if she hadn't been successful. And similarly, the early climbers Anna and Ellen Pidgeon note that despite having climbed over 60 alpine peaks, members of the Alpine Club still wouldn't speak to them. And it's on this note that I want to move now to think about the relationship between early women climbers and climbing clubs. So this brings us to the starting point of our timeline, and this begins in 1907. 1907 sees the foundation of the Ladies' Alpine Club. Now, the Alpine Club, which was founded about half a century earlier in 1857, did not allow women membership, and so there was a desperate need for a women's climbing club. The Ladies' Alpine Club established their premises at the Grand Central Hotel at Marylebone train station. But it's notable that even at this time, with the very distinct separation between the Ladies' Alpine Club and the Alpine Club, there was a general perception in the mountaineering community that the Ladies' Alpine Club was somehow an inferior cousin to the Alpine Club. Now, Elizabeth the Blonde, who we've met earlier, became the first president of the Ladies' Alpine Club, swiftly followed by Lucy Walker. So the following year, 1908, sees the foundation of the Ladies' Scottish Climbing Club, and we sort of see this trend now all the way up to the end of the First World War, where you're getting a lot more access to mountains, there's better transport, people from less economically privileged backgrounds picking up climbing. And you're also seeing developments in technology. Rope is still hemp-based, there's no nylon yet, but throughout the sort of early 1900s into the 1920s, you start seeing people moving from climbing in hobnail boots to rubber-soled sticky climbing shoes. Dorothy Pilley, who we'll meet later in the exhibition, describes climbing for the first time in these rubber shoes in 1924, and she describes this floating feeling of dancing across rock in these featherweight shoes. So it must be noted that women-only climbing clubs were not the only option available for women climbers at this time. In 1906, the Felon Rock Club was founded, and this was mixed membership from the start, a fact that's reflected in the fact that it was sometimes rather spuriously referred to as the Fell and Frock Club. Despite the fact that there was mixed membership, this club still suffered from perceptions of being very male-dominated. In 1907, it only had 8 women members, and it was this dissatisfaction with this male domination of the Felon Rock Club that led to a very chance meeting between Pat Kelly and Eleanor, often known as Len, Winthrop Young, in 1920. The pair had met in a hotel in the Lake District, and in this meeting they discussed their frustrations with the Fell and Rock Club. It was at this point that the spark of an idea occurred to them. This led in 1921 to the foundation of the Pinnacle Club, and this is a women's only climbing club. The first meet of the Pinnacle Club was held in Easter of 1921 in Llanberis, and shortly afterwards the club also held its very first alpine meet. Now, this meet was described by one of the participants, Lillian Bray, in quite scandalous terms. The women climbed without guides, and Lillian Bray wrote, "We never breathed a word of this to anyone. It was so unusual for women to be climbing in the Alps guideless at this time." On the trip, Dorothy Pilley wore a mauve sunbonnet, a fact that Lillian Bray picks up on, and she says it simply is not done to climb in a bonnet. However, even if climbing guideless was something that was frowned upon, a key tenet of the Pinnacle Club from its inception was the idea of climbing without other men present. Now, this phrase, manless climbing, is something that you start to see appearing quite a lot in women's writing of the time from the 1920s and 1930s. Miriam Underhill describes the reasoning behind this manless climbing trend, and she argues that when one leads a climb, you're engaging with problems, problem solving, you're thinking about routes, you're making tactical decisions, and all of these are rewards that you can only really get if you're leading. And there's a sense that if men are present, women can never really be perceived as taking control of each of these different dynamics. But by the 1920s and 30s, even if women's climbing is not generally accepted by society, there's quite a growing sense in select sections of the climbing community that women could and should mountaineer. Following the death of Elizabeth the Blonde, Colonel Leslie Strutt of the Alpine Club says that no mountaineer of either gender could surpass her. And I think there's definitely a sense evolving at this time of the relationship between the clubs. At the 1927 anniversary of the Fell and Rock Club, Len Winthrop Young gives a speech and she describes the dynamic between the clubs. The Alpine Club is like a grandfatherly figure wearing a Savile Row tailored suit. The Fell and Rock Club is a young, bright, cheerful and charming man, and the Ladies Alpine Club forms something of an older sister figure. So at this point, and thinking about the relationships of the clubs as they move into the interwar period, we're going to move now into the main hall of the exhibition. So, as we enter the main hall of the exhibition, you'll see that the exhibition pulls out the stories of 12 pioneering female climbers. Today, I'm just going to talk you through the stories of a couple of these, starting with Dorothy Pilley. Pilley was born in 1894 in Camberwell in London, and she was active in climbing at a very interesting time. So in the sort of 1920s and 1930s, we start to see the shift away from a kind of the tail end of the golden age of alpinism, a time of club meetings, annual dinners, journals, law and mystique, and a movement towards a shift of climbing technology, thinking about planning. And this is quite an interesting time. We've already heard Pilley describe the experience of climbing in rubber sole climbing shoes for the first time. And for Pilley, climbing was something that really was rooted in her identity. She describes going to Wales hill walking for the first time in her life as being like waking up from a half sleep. At another time, she describes the cognitive dissonance of returning home from a climbing trip and having to fit back in to urban life. And she sort of says climbing is something that goes down into the form and fabric of my being. So, as is probably clear, Pilley had something of a soul of a poet, and her book, a memoir of her climbing experiences, published in 1935 called Climbing Days, is a classic example of this. Now, Pilley had both read a lot of classic mountaineering texts, but also she was very aware of the experiences of Elizabeth the Blonde, and she writes, "Oh, how I admired that great woman." And I think this is something that's quite interesting in Pilley's story, because Pilley's book, Climbing Days, went on to inspire her great-great-nephew, Dan Richards, to write a similar book also titled Climbing Days, in which he retraces Pilley's experience. So with Pilley, we really see the sense of her knowledge and understanding of Elizabeth the Blonde's climbing influencing her experiences, and then Pilley going on to inspire the next generation. And I think this is one of those stories that resonates throughout the exhibition, that sense of knowing that women have always been there in the mountains and have gone there before you really affects and changes your own conception of what possibilities there might be for yourself. So speaking of climbing ambitions, I now want to talk about one of Pilley's most famous ascents, and this is the North Ridge of the Dent Blanche in 1928. Pilley referred to 1928 as her great year, and the Dent Blanche at the time in the 1920s was one of the great problems, one of the great unclimbed problems in the Alps. Now, in the Alpine Club's own guidebook, the 4,000 metre peaks of the Alps, there's a beautiful description of the Dent Blanche. It's described as being like a rounded form of the Matterhorn. It's 4 symmetrical ridges forming a cross when viewed from above. Pilley described the Dent Blanche as the White Witch. Now, while the Dent Blanche had been climbed by the southern ridge far earlier in the 1800s, the North Ridge is a completely different proposition. In the present, its technical difficulties give it a grade of TD in alpine grading. On 20th of July 1928, Pilley, her husband, I.A. Richards, and Joseph and Antoine George set off for their objective on the Dent Blanche. They'd spent the previous evening in an alpine hut, trying their best not to stare out the windows at their proposed route and giggling nervously to each other every time they caught each other doing so. Now, when they set off in the morning, the first challenge was a slab infested with verglas. They changed into rubber climbing shoes to attempt this delicate 200-metre traverse. As they did so, rocks fell around them, and Pilley describes them screaming and wailing as the rocks scatter into the void. After negotiating this delicate traverse, the next challenge was making it over a bulge shaped like a nose to make it onto the final ridge to the summit. Now, Joseph George, who made this attempt first, found himself just crucially short of some key handholds that he needed to surmount the bulge. However, they quickly developed a new technique. An ice axe could be wedged into a short crack, the shaft in the crack itself, with the head of the axe facing outwards, and this axe head acted as a sort of a springboard or foothold from which the climbers could then reach the crucial holds. Now, to make this move, George described as being like taking a leap into the void, and Antoine George, who took up the rear, had to make this move without the assistance of the ice axe because he removed it to move up, and he described it rather touchingly as a droll sensation. Having surmounted this difficulty, Pilley and her husband found themselves sharing a small ledge about the size of a saucer with only one handhold between them. Now, fortunately for Pilley, Richards was something loose in the limbs, and Pilley described him as having a tendency to climb using footholds around the level of his chin, and these acrobatics served them well as the couple pressed themselves into this tiny space. This very much amused the guides when Pilley and Richards were spotted in this quite uncompromising position. Antoine George made the comment, "Ah, the lovers, the amoureux!" Now, with this obstacle surmounted, the way to the summit was clear. The climbers emerged out of this dark, icy ridge into brilliant sunshine, and they made the summit around 5 p.m. in the evening. Now, this ascent was impressive not only because of its technical difficulty and because of the small size of the climbing team, but because a few days earlier, Pilley had had a terrible accident. She'd fallen into a crevasse, and the experience had left her very badly shaken. She described making the approach that day as though walking on a field of soap buds, constantly assessing the snow around her in fear that she might slip through again. But I think and the way that the narrative very much ends for Pilley of this ascent, it's one of elation. And you can really sort of see that joy coming through. And thinking now about how this evolution in climbing technology enabled Pilley, these rubber rock shoes, to make this delicate traverse and complete an ascent like the Dent Blanche. We're going to move on now to have a look at some of the artefacts in the exhibition. So Pilley's ascent of the Dent Blanche in 1928 really marks a turning point, and it's at this stage that we start seeing quite regular, impressive alpine ascents being made by women. Now, part of this, as I've already alluded to, is the fact that the development in climbing technology made harder and harder ascents possible. In these cases of artefacts, you can see some of the development of the equipment that climbers would have used at the time. And this is one of my favourite parts of the exhibition, because you see people coming in, and especially when they're intergenerational parties, people start reminiscing over using gear like this and discussing the changes since they started climbing. And I know for a fact my dad definitely has some stuff that's very similar to this in his garage at the moment. Another thing that I want to point out as we start moving through the artefacts is this phenomenal pair of leggings, and thinking now about the changes in what women were able to wear when they were out and about climbing compared to those early experiences in the 1850s when they're slipping the skirts off and on to maintain a sense of propriety. Now, with that being said, this brings us now into the 1950s. Now, the 1950s sees author and Pinnacle Club member Gwen Moffat become the first female mountain guide. At the same time, the 1950s also sees quite a transitionary moment in the broader picture of climbing. Climbers start looking further away from the Alps and towards the greater ranges. And it's at this point in the decade of the 1950s that we see the first ascents of 13 of the 14 8,000 metre peaks. And so on this note, we're going to move to the next section of the exhibition and talk about another set of key women climbers from this decade. So, in the 1950s, we also see a spate of women-led expeditions to the Himalayas, and one of these in 1956 was led by Eileen Healy. Now, Eileen Healy was a pharmacologist by trade, but she also was an extensive diarist, and in the Alpine Club library we have several volumes of her diaries. And one of the things that always strikes me when reading her diary entries is that she's got a real eye for food and drink, and she's always giving you these little tasting notes about the things that she's eating. Truly a woman after my own heart. In one of these diary extracts from the Himalayan expedition of 1956, Healy describes some of the dynamics that she encountered as part of this expedition. In particular, she's concerned with one of the Sherpa climbers who accompanies her, named Chandra. Chandra learns how to use crampons quite quickly. He also watches Healy cut steps with an ice axe, and having observed her doing so, he then starts making suggestions about potential route choices, how and when to climb. So accounts of Healy and Chandra's relationship, I think, are quite revealing about some of the complexities that Himalayan climbers would have experienced at the time. There's not just the obvious gender dynamic, there's also a racial dynamic. There's disparities in terms of the group's mountaineering experience. There's also a financial aspect. At one point, Chandra buys Healy a cup of tea, and she's quite perplexed at this gesture and really doesn't know what to make of it. And this discomfort cuts both ways. In one anecdote, Healy recounts being caught out in bad weather, and she invites some of the porters to share a tent with her to shelter from the storm, and they're absolutely scandalised by this. So there's a very real sense that everyone in these expeditions are constantly trying to negotiate and work out exactly what it means for women to be in the mountains. And I think this brings us quite nicely to the 1959 International Women's Expedition to Cho Oyu. Now, Cho Oyu was first climbed in 1954 by an Austrian party, but in 1954, French swimwear designer and mountaineer Claude Cogan was also on the mountain, and she turned away just 500 metres shy of the summit. being forced to do so by the bad weather filled Cogan with what she described as a sense of boiling, impotent rage. And so, when she returned back to the UK, she began putting together the pieces that would eventually become the Women's International Chirayou Expedition. In 1955, she'd been invited to speak at the Alpine Club. In 1956, she joined the Ladies' Alpine Club, and in 1957 was present at an annual dinner. Each of these opportunities allowed Cogan to begin to assemble the team that was eventually comprised of British, French, Belgian and Indian climbers. Of those, some of the women pictured here, Eileen Healy, and behind me Dorothy Grafina, also accompanied with Margaret Darville, are the climbers I'd like to talk about today. In the 1959 expedition, Healy was to serve as cinematographer. Now, she had no formal training in this art. In fact, in several of her diary entries, we can read about her struggling with a camera. In one account, she struggles to wind on the film, it hasn't wound on properly. She accidentally opens the back of the camera, the film flies out, and she writes, has there ever been such a nitwit? So with this in mind, Healy wrote to the BBC to ask for advice on how to film such a venture. She received a letter back that advised her to mix combinations of long panoramic viewpoints of the scenery with much closer up shots of details, things like pegging out tents. And if you look closely at the letter, you might recognise the signature. That's David Attenborough. Now, in the film that Healy eventually produced, which you can see as part of the Women with Altitude exhibition, you can see that Healy really has followed Attenborough's advice to the letter, and you see exactly the kinds of shots that he describes. And Attenborough's letter was not the only support that the expedition received. Tenzing Norgay was heavily involved in the planning of the operation. He handpicked Sherpas to climb with the women to higher altitudes, and it's notable that the expedition also employed up to about 40 female porters. Regardless of this, I think there's still a sense of women having to negotiate how much help and assistance they can take in the mountains. And it's notable that Claude Cogan was absolutely dead set on not letting Sherpas do any of the hard work like fixing lines. There was a real sense that this would undermine the independence of the women's expedition. Likewise, a journalist who accompanied the expedition was made to wait behind at Namche Bazaar, and there was a real sense that any men at all in the proximity of these women climbers might somehow undermine this women's only event. And thinking back to those days when Miriam Underhill writes about manless climbing, you can kind of see an ongoing trajectory here of thinking about the ways in which women need to prove themselves in the mountains. In 1959, despite having to negotiate these very complex personal and interpersonal dynamics, there's still an overwhelming sense that the expedition is going well. Claudine van der Straten and Claude Cogan are both acclimatised well, and they managed to establish Camp 4 at around 7,000 metres. However, once they've established this camp, they're hit by quite heavy snowfall, and so they decide to evacuate a large number of the Sherpa support team, leaving just van der Straten, Cogan and Annie Norbu at Camp 4. For several days afterwards, at Camp 2, there's a growing sense of unease, and eventually 2 Sherpas, Chirang and Wangdi, are sent up the mountain to try and bring supplies and check in with the higher team. Unfortunately, both Sherpas are caught in an avalanche. Chirang is killed instantly, and Wangdi, partially buried, manages to excavate himself, but is left suffering from very severe frostbite. From this moment onwards, it becomes clear that something has gone quite terribly wrong on the higher reaches of the mountain. Dorothy Gravina mounts a rescue attempt, reaching the location of Camp 4, but they can find no trace of any of the climbers. In the wake of this tragedy, it's Gravina who then organises the evacuation from the mountain. And in doing so, there's a very real sense stemming from the Pinnacle Club that there's a pressing need for another women's Himalayan expedition almost as soon as possible to really build on the momentum that Cogan had been able to put into place. And this is formally realised in the 1962 expedition to Jagdula. into the 1970s then, we see another key date in the history of the Ladies Alpine Club. In 1974, the Alpine Club votes to allow women membership for the first time. And at this point, there's a general sense that the clubs should then amalgamate rather than continuing as two separate and distinct organisations. We can see in lists of membership published in 1975 a list of the women members who came across from the Ladies Alpine Club at this time. And in 2000, Joanna Schwartz produced a full index documenting the entire history of the Ladies Alpine Club journal from its inception in 1907 to 1975. We also see in the Alpine Club library that many of the books from the Ladies Alpine Club have come across to us, and these are denoted by book plates that you can find in the front of these books. And with this brings us to the final section of the exhibition. So throughout this tour today, I've tried to pull out some of the stories of some of the pioneering women climbers of their generation. However, it's important to note that not all women who are active in the mountains were leaving written records of their own experiences. There may have been far, far more women out there than we can currently testify to. And I think this is one of the most important themes of the exhibition. It's a call to think very critically about how we tell histories of climbing and mountaineering, and think about whose voices are historically elevated and whose have been marginalised. Now, with that being said, I want to point out that the story doesn't end there. There are many, many more fantastic women climbers active in the present, and you can see on the banners behind me some of the names that you may well be familiar with. People like Kathy Dowd, Melanie Windridge, Julianne Clymer, Adele Long, Annabelle Barker, Gwen Moffat, Rona Lampard. All of these women are active in both the Pinnacle Club and the Alpine Club in the present, and in fact you may even find some of them invigilating the exhibition. And that has been one of the real joys of seeing this entire exhibition come together, is getting to sit and talk with the women who have been so pivotively involved in the history of women's climbing, and get to hear their own stories in their own words. And with that being said, I'd like to point out that we do also have a small bookshop set up here in the exhibition space where you can read about the experiences of some of these women written in their own words. And I think on that note, this is probably how I want to end. And at the beginning of the tour, I posed this question, noted by Arlene Blum: why do you go to the mountains? And the answer, I think, can be found in the 1932 edition of the Ladies Alpine Club Journal. The editor poses this exact question to many of the members, and the resounding answer is, because I like it. Thank you very much for joining me on this tour, and please do look at our online resources if you want to explore the history of women's alpinism any further. Thank you.